I think if you ever invite me again, I would prefer to go after somebody who's not good at their job, because this is going to be kind of bad in comparison.
I am super excited to have you here, Roy. This is Roy Rapoport, who is the Director of Engineering at Netflix. He's been in tech for over 20 years with positions in IT, engineering and operations, software development, and software quality engineering. And Roy, I think you have a large hiring challenge, not just because of the scale, but also because you have a multidisciplinary or you have multidisciplinary tech requirements at Netflix. And can I ask you maybe to tell us a bit about your background and how you got to where you are today?
Well, I think that maybe, forgive me, I have a small and simple brain, so I tend to sort of decompose everything into atomic parts. I would say that my journey has essentially sort of progressed on two axes. One is sort of like the technical stuff, and I've sort of mostly oscillated between IT and engineering. I think most of my life, I've spent half of my professional life in IT and half of it in engineering, though these days I think that the lines between them are potentially a little mixed. The other journey has essentially been between being an individual contributor and then being a first level manager, being a second level manager. And at this point, I'm actually the lead of leads. So there are managers in my organization that don't report directly to me, but who report to leaders under me. Um, for me, what I've always prioritized in when I've considered taking a job is essentially like what's the next most interesting thing in front of me rather than career progression. So if you look at my LinkedIn profile, which is relatively accurate, though of course full of exaggerations about what I've accomplished, you'll see a lot of movements between being an IC and being a people leader because it's never been important to me to sort of maintain a smooth progression. Does that answer your question?
I think so. And yeah, hello, I'm Zoe Cunningham. I'm a director at Software, where I have a number of responsibilities, including hosting our Software Tech Talks podcast. Now, I'd like to just take the opportunity before we start to say that we would love to, I'm speaking on Roy's behalf here, Roy would love to answer questions from the audience. So please do put them into the question panel. Could I ask someone from CTO Craft to clear the ones from the previous session as well, so that I can be sure that they're questions for Roy. And yeah, and in the meantime, let's talk about the fact that there are only so many hours in a day, right? Because you have requirements to bring people into your team and you have some team members to help with that. But what kind of overall percentage of your team and your team's time is being spent on hiring?
I don't know how much of this information has gotten across the Atlantic or Pacific, depending on who we're talking with. I'm not going to assume that everybody here is from Europe. Netflix is going through a bit of a rough time at the present. It's now public knowledge that we had a wave of layoffs about 2 weeks ago. It's public knowledge that um, our finances are struggling a little bit. So I would say that the amount of time we're spending on hiring right now is actually a little lower than normal because, frankly, we're not hiring as actively as we would have been, for example, a year or so ago. It's also difficult because, to some degree, essentially, how much time we spend is, well, again, proportional to how many open positions we've got. I will tell you that right now in my org, we literally have no open positions until about a week and a half from now when one of my managers is going to be leaving. And at that point, I'll be looking to hire. At that point, anybody who would be involved in this, so if I'm the hiring manager, I would expect to spend a good 20 to 30% of my time on filling that one position. As a matter of prioritization at Netflix, the assumption is that secondary to production emergencies, hiring takes priority.
Fantastic. And I've just scaled that up in my head. So once you have 5 open positions, that's it. You can't hire anyone else. Is that right? Or have you got economies of scale?
Well, I think I don't. Again, I'm just a I'm just a mediocre leader, I wouldn't be able to hire for 5 different positions at the same time, given the amount of effort that is expected to be put into every single position. So if I've got 5 of the same position, I need 5 back-end engineers. That's not a big deal, right? Because essentially, the pipeline is the same. But we tend in general, and we've been trying to figure out scale, but in general, we have looked at every position every team's position as relatively bespoke. And so if I ended up with 5 different positions in that I'm responsible for, frankly, I'd be chatting with my talent acquisition partner who'd be like, look, we can make very slow movement on these 5 positions, but we shouldn't. We should prioritize them aggressively. And in general, our preference is to not try to have a hiring manager focus on more than one role at a time. Now, the
Great. Well,
role
that,
again,
yeah.
may have multiple positions in case you're looking for, similar people. But I personally don't. I personally don't work on more than one role at a time. Think about it from like writing code and everything we know in terms of like limiting work in progress. It's
Right.
a similar.
Yeah, not splitting your focus. I love it.
Yeah.
And so if you need a talent acquisition manager, they go to the top of the pile, do they? In terms of which
Um,
role you're recruiting for first.
Well, potentially, except that I would argue that I have the ability to move forward without a lot of partnership from our talent acquisition people because and I should reach out independently to people out there and have ongoing conversations. So, in my ideal world, when I have an open position, I already know somebody who I think might be great. I've already had a bunch of conversations with them, and then all I really need is some people to interview them and relatively lightweight engagement from our talent organization to deal with basically scheduling and all of that sort of like logistical stuff.
Amazing. So we've got questions coming in already, and the first one is very similar to, or it's in the same sphere, I think, as what you just said about reaching out to people yourself. So do you ever kind of recruit in reverse order where you come across someone great and then you find or create a position for them because you can see that they will add to your organization, even if you didn't know it beforehand? Sorry, I've paraphrased a little there, Mark. I hope that's okay.
I do something slightly different. My my primary responsibility is not necessarily to Netflix, but I would argue to the tech ecosystem as a whole. So I would say I have a lot of conversations with people outside of Netflix where I get to know them and I try to sort of see what they're good at and what I can do to help them. So I think it's quite often actually been the case that I've actually like found somebody great and was thought that the right role for them would actually not be at Netflix, and then I've made introductions to people outside of Netflix. If there is a role for them at Netflix, that's great. We can potentially see about filling that role, creating that role. It's less likely to be the case, I think, both right now because we're a little more constrained on headcount. So I have to be a lot more thoughtful about it. And I'm doing a lot less opportunistic hiring than I would be, let's say, 2, 3 years ago. But also because I think one of our cultural values here is essentially a pretty hard nosed, you create the right organization and the right organizational structure, not you find the structure that works for the people you want to have here. So we tend to shy away from modifying the organization to make great people fit here. We tend to be relatively sort of focused on what is the right structure for the organization and have some trust and belief that we'll find great people to fit that structure, if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense. And it leads seamlessly onto the next question. Did you know that? So the next question is Netflix has been a little in the news around employee disgruntlement around content on the platform. So I think I know which instance is being referred to. And you've just mentioned that you have this intentional culture. So does this feed into your hiring? How does it affect your hiring? And is there anything Netflix would change after this has happened, in hindsight?
Well, Are you asking me to speak on behalf of Netflix here? Look, I'll be blunt here, and I'm aware that I'm assuming we're being recorded, and I'm certainly not going to say anything here that I wouldn't be willing to say to Ted Sarandos, my CEO. I have friends and, frankly, ex romantic partners who are trans. I have trans coworkers, and I have friends who are trans who used to be coworkers but who left the company because of Netflix's stance on content that uh, some people will say is transphobic, some people will say is simply offensive to trans people. One of the things I appreciate about Netflix, and it's a little hard to swallow sometimes, is that Netflix has been willing to be relatively clear about its priorities, even when that makes people unhappy. And I think that's frankly the most, or maybe the least, or maybe both, we can ask from companies. Like, be honest about what matters to you so people can make the right decisions for them about whether or not they want to come to the company, whether or not they want to stay at the company. A good example of that is the fact that Netflix recently went through another regular iteration of modifying its culture memo. And one of the things that it explicitly said was, we are going to have content on that you may have a problem with. And you will need to decide whether that's enough of a problem to not work here or not. And that's a personal decision that everybody's going to make. I don't think Netflix is walking away from that. Every indication I've had is that at every opportunity Ted has had to reconsider that, he has doubled down on that perspective. And Ted, by definition, speaks for Netflix in a way that I don't. I think it does affect our hiring because some people, based on that information, will choose to not come to Netflix.
Mm, and it's right, but like you say, at the end of the day, if the organization is clear, it's not like they're saying one thing, they're saying, come and work here, and we'll make sure that we are only sharing content with that reflects these values, and then not doing that, right? That's a very different thing to saying, this is what we are. You choose. You choose if you want to work with us or not. And then within the organization, right, that's a choice that you have to make as well as the people that you're hiring, right?
Yeah, and it does create, profound challenges. I just went through a week-long seminar here for Netflix directors and above that was entirely around the philosophy and ethics of leadership. It taught us nothing. One of the things I've described, I've said to people is, I have never thought so hard and learned so little. But the ethics of what we do are complicated, and maybe there are companies where that's not the case. One of the things I struggle with and wrestle with is that these trade-offs hurt people. And working here essentially means I work in a company that makes trade-offs that hurt people. Sometimes they're hurt because they opted into a system that eventually lays them off. Sometimes they're hurt because we make content. And so we have a profound effect with 200 million members out there to influence the conversations out there. And that's something that everybody who works here needs to figure out a way to be sufficiently okay with to stay or leave.
This is such an incredible chat, and we have so little time left. I can't believe it. I want to, yeah, thank you so much, Roy. Just to echo the chat for your candor, it's just making for an absolutely fantastic session. So a comment from Louisa: hire fast, fire faster. How do you fire people at Netflix, or what are your criteria for firing people?
The biggest, I think, miscommunication we have, the biggest misperception people have, I think, about Netflix is the whole idea of hire fast, fire faster. I think we've gotten pretty decent at hiring fast. We don't really particularly fire fast, I would argue. And if you look at our internal stats, our first year termination rates are something on the order of, I think, far less than 3%. So I don't think that less than 3% people leaving within their first year feels to me like firing faster. I think what it means for me, having been here for about 13 years and having managed people for most of that time and having terminated my fair share of people, is this. I think every leader goes through a process of, when somebody's performance suffers, of um, trying to work with them, and then at some point losing faith that this is going to work out. And in a lot of other companies I've worked at, once you've lost faith that this is going to work out, you talk to your HR group and you start a lengthy process of figuring out essentially how to terminate that person. The difference is that at Netflix, once you've lost faith that somebody's going to be able to work out, then the distance between that day and the day that they get terminated can literally be like several hours. So I'll give you an example. The first person I ever fired at Netflix, I went to my HR person. It was Wednesday, 4 p.m. And I said, I've decided to fire Bob. And she asked me two questions. She asked me, is he going to be surprised? And what do you regret the most? And we had like a 20-minute conversation. And then she said, okay, we can be ready by about 11 a.m. tomorrow. And I said, he's working on something right now. How about next Tuesday? And she was like, that's fine. It doesn't mean that we sort of throw people away quickly, like I think the impression from the outside is. And I'll give you another example. When I rejoined Netflix, two of the three leaders I had working for me, people expected that I would fire. And frankly, people would have been surprised if I didn't fire. And I started working with the first one because I tend to serialize these things. And I remember having a conversation with her where I was like, this was December 2019. I was like, it's clear to me that you personally and your team failed in 2019. And if I fired people for failing, we would be having a very different and last conversation right now. But I fire people because I no longer have faith they can be successful. And I have faith in you. So that was the end of 2019. She was an engineering manager. She turned things around. About a year and a half later, I promoted her to director. She's doing amazingly well. So does that give you maybe a slightly different perspective?
I think that's a fantastic perspective, and I think it kind of really matches what I've seen be successful, right? Which is you have it's a really good way of describing it, like when you lose faith in someone. But before that point, you have the opportunity, or you have an obligation, I think, as a leader to support and help people and definitely communicate with them around. Certainly, I love the question, will they be surprised? How often do you get that right?
Netflix or me?
You personally, just because I'll tell you where I'm coming from. I find that however much I think people aren't going to be surprised, they're surprised more often than I would expect.
Can I ask you a question?
Hmm.
Have you worked much with Israelis?
Uh, Not a huge number, a few.
We're kind of jerks sometimes. Like the default failure mode for Israelis, I feel like, is kind of like blunt jerk. And it's a failure mode that I try to be responsible for. I was born and raised in Israel. But I don't know that I've found a lot of people from my culture who tend to be surprising on that front. So no, I have literally never surprised anyone when I've terminated them. But that's because I'm, even within a company known for candor and bluntness, I have something of a reputation for being an outlier for candor and bluntness.
Right. Whereas the British, we're all like, I'm sure I said something really strong, whereas what I actually said was like, oh, maybe you could just try a little bit harder or something
I
similar.
will tell you, I will tell you one of the things I've told my org, and I came up with this in 2016 because there are people at Netflix who can be afraid of like, I'm going to get terminated and I'm not going to see it happen. And I'm not going to see it coming. And it has happened, though not with me. In 2016 was the first time I actually solidified a promise to everybody directly reporting to me, which is this: if your job is at risk, you will know that because I will use the phrase, your job is at risk. If I have not used that phrase and you're asking yourself, is my job at risk? The answer is explicitly no.
What better note to finish on? Thank you so much, Roy. This has just been an absolutely incredible session. And my two takeaways are candor and prioritization. Like, do one thing at a time. Fantastic advice.
Thanks, Zoe. It's been lovely. Thank you so much for inviting me.